Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the latest webinar from St Mary's University, Twickenham, with me, Saeed Kamal. Here at St Mary's, I'm a Professor of Politics and International Relations. And we're also proud that St Mary's is #1 in London for course and teaching satisfaction in the Guardian University Guide 2020. If you want to find out more about studying here, please visit our website, www.stmarys.ac.uk. Now, for today's webinar on the future of higher education post-COVID-19, we're delighted to be joined by Nick Hillman of the Higher Education Policy Institute and Ron Barnett, Emeritus Professor at UCL. Before I introduce our speakers, can I just talk you through the proceedings? We will be recording this webinar and it will be available later on our St Mary's website, so please do bear that in mind. We will start with remarks or a presentation from Nick and then Ron. Please feel free to submit questions during their presentations. Don't feel that you have to wait until the Q&A afterwards, but of course you can do so if you wish. When asking questions, please don't be shy, but if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can select this option in Q&A. There's also a chat function. If you move your mouse or your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see both Q&A and chat. Please don't use the chat function for questions. Use that to share any relevant links. I'll also ask both speakers if there are any particular links they want to share with the audience. But also if you want to report a technical problem, so we can check whether it's your end or at our end. Now, after Nick and then Ron are finished speaking, I will move to the Q&A and I will ask the questions on your behalf. So please do submit your full question in Q&A. If we have more questions than time allows, what I tend to use is ask people to use the vote function in a very democratic way. The ones at the top of the table will then be put to our speakers today. And that helps me choose the questions in a very democratic way. So now to our speakers. Nick Hillman has been Director of the Higher Education Policy Institute since 2014. Nick worked for the now Lord Willetts when he was Minister for Universities and Science from 2007 until the end of 2013, and as Chief of Staff and a Special Advisor in the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. Previously, he was a history teacher and worked at the Association of British Insurers. He's written for a range of think tanks and journals on higher education. Ron Barnett is Emeritus Professor of Higher Education at University College London Institute of Education, where he was a Dean and a Pro-Director. He's a past chair of the Society for Research into Higher Education, where he is now a fellow. He's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and the Higher Education Academy, and has published 35 books and over 150 papers, given keynote talks across the world, and is a consultant in the university sector. He's also the inaugural president of the recently formed Philosophy and Theory of Higher Education Society. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to hand the floor over to you, Nick, to start with your presentation.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just going to bring my presentation up on the screen, I hope. So I'm sure you'll let me know if you can't see that, but fantastic. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure to serve as Ron's warm-up act, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ron has to say. For those people who don't know, HEPI, and you just gave me a very kind introduction, is the UK's only specialist higher education think tank. We're supported by universities up and down the UK, nearly all universities, and I'm very pleased to say our newest subscribing institution is indeed St Mary's, and it's fantastic to be in closer touch with your institution and your new Vice-Chancellor, Anthony, who I know from years gone by. And we do all the things that think tanks do, as explained on the screen there. Some of our recent reports are also just on the screen. So we've been given this title of the future of higher education post-COVID-19, and I am slightly tempted to say a little bit like that famous made-up quote about the French Revolution, that it's too early to say. But of course, that hasn't stopped others from making really quite firm conclusions about how COVID-19 is going to affect our sector over the long term. I mean, just to give you a few examples, here's a piece from University World News where someone based in a Moroccan university makes some rather bold claims about how COVID will lead to a new type of institution called a new global university, where barriers will be almost entirely done away with, and some rather flowery language if you look at the article. Or to take another piece, this is from the World Economic Forum that says COVID-19 has shaken the education system like a lightning bolt to its core. Again, predicting some very profound changes throughout higher education across the whole world, really. And closer to home, this piece from the New Statesman also made some very bold claims, particularly around what it means for people learning online for free, and in a hugely expanded way. So that's what people are saying. I'm happy to make these slides available afterwards as well. But I think all the pieces that have been written, like these three that I've shown, have one thing in common, which is they are all actually exceptionally vague about the future. They all promise a brave new world, and they all have lots of colourful, long, flowery terms to describe the new world. And for example, that piece, that Davos piece, the World Economic Forum piece, talked about how there was going to be a long overdue revolution in education and a whole new educational paradigm. But as I say, they're all actually incredibly vague. And there's a good reason why HEPI, when we're giving instructions to our authors, suggests people don't use terms like paradigm, because they often seem to be a way of avoiding making specific suggestions, and sometimes an excuse just for suggesting everything's going to change without really ever explaining how and why. And the other thing that strikes me about a lot of the rhetoric about how COVID will change higher education is that it's sometimes strikingly unoriginal. In fact, it's often claiming to be very original, but in fact, very unoriginal. Technological innovations and wider changes in society are always predicted to make enormous changes in our sector. I mean, here's Thomas Edison back in the 1910s saying that there'll be no real need for lectures or traditional lessons in future, because or indeed for books, because you could just have the world's best lecturers appearing in the local cinemas, and why would anybody bother to read a book or go and listen to a lecture? And of course, very similar claims were made when cassette tapes were invented, when the radio became common. VHS tapes were also going to absolutely transform learning beyond all recognition. And of course, all those innovations did improve teaching and learning, but none of them made quite the scale of change that people at the time predicted. And in fact, much about what goes on in higher education today it would have been recognizable to Thomas Edison's peers 100 years or so ago. And I would argue that today's first year students, while they're having a very different university experience to my time as a fresher 30 years ago, I think that is to a large degree down to the pandemic. And I actually suspect by the time they reach their final year, if the pandemic, let's all hope, has gone away by then, that their final year will actually have more in common with my final year a little bit less than 30 years ago than with some of the wilder visions of the future that I've presented and which other people are saying, whether those predictions date from the 1920s or the 2020s. So in a moment, I'll turn to 6 changes that I think, however, the crisis might wreak through our sector, but they're slightly smaller and hopefully crunchier than the ones in those pieces that I presented in my early slides. But just before I do that, I just want to talk about a few caveats which limit, I think, our ability to foretell the future and how COVID is affecting higher education. The first is there's lots of other changes going on. If it wasn't for COVID, you'd probably still be doing a seminar today, but we'd probably be talking about Brexit or the spending review that's coming up, or I don't know, maybe the the next ref round. And it may not, once the COVID crisis is out of the way, always be possible to disentangle the changes that have been wreaked by COVID and the changes that have been wreaked by other things. So if for are less keen to come than in the past, and I don't know if that will happen or not. Could be because of COVID. It could be because Brexit makes us look more insular. It could be because geopolitics, I don't know, US presidential election results or something has changed the relationship between America and China. Or it could be because people in China just decide they want to stay at home. Or it could be because of changes in global wealth patterns. So we have to remember that there would still be changes going on even if COVID hadn't happened. The second thing is many people assume higher education is a conservative sector with a little c, definitely not with a big C, of course, but with a little c, and that it's very staid and stable and slow to change. And I think sometimes that's probably true, but I think two things mean it's not always true. One is how quickly things have changed, for example, in moving teaching and learning online since the crisis began back in March. Another thing is, I mean, just in my time at HEPI, there's been the most phenomenal set of changes that have washed over the sector. I mean, you know, for example, just in the last 5 years, we've had 5 ministers for universities. We've had 4 secretaries of state for education. We've had 3 prime ministers. We've had 2 general elections. We've had a really big bit of higher education legislation, the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017, which led to, you know, HEFCE being abolished and all the other changes. So when considering COVID's impact on our sector, I think it's wrong to regard our sector as being something that isn't used to change, because I think we have got used to quite profound change. And then I think the third caveat, before I come on to my list in the second half of my talk, the list of things that I think probably will change in our sector as a result of COVID, I think my third caveat is, even when we know that things are changing and in dispute and up in the air, it's not always clear what the end result will be. So we all know that there were, you know, profound problems with school exams this year. And we know that the government's way of solving that, the initial way, wasn't one that could sustain, and therefore, you know, went from algorithms to teacher assessments, etc., etc. Nobody quite knows where that leaves us. Some people think it means exams have had their day and we should move to a world where teachers are listened to, continuous assessment, you know, it becomes the norm. Other people think, well, actually the mess shows exams, despite all their faults, are rather better than the alternatives. Anthony McLaren, your Vice-Chancellor, went from his days at UCAS, will remember all the debates about post-qualification admissions. Again, some people think this summer's row mean post-qualification admissions are an obvious thing that must happen. Other people think actually it shows we shouldn't change the normal system that we've got. So we have to be a little bit careful, I think, even when we know change is coming, of saying exactly what it will be. But with all that long preamble, I just want to talk about 6 things that I think are fairly certain, if not completely certain. And the first is based partly on this Institute for Fiscal Studies report that got a lot of coverage when it came out a couple of months ago. And I have lots of problems with this report, and you'll find a blog on the HEPI website. We do a daily blog, which you can sign up for free on our homepage. I wrote a blog saying some of the problems I think with their modelling. For example, they assumed there'd be fewer home students this year than ever before, which has always seemed to be an absurd presumption, given the alternatives to education this year are so poor. You can't get a job, you can't go on a gap year. So I have some problems with this report, but I think the fundamental truth at the heart of this report is true. And what they said was some universities could be pushed to the wall financially during the crisis because some institutions were weak financially even before the crisis, and now the crisis is imposing a set of additional problems on them. And I think that is fundamentally true. And I think even the government accepts that, because before the crisis, the government said, well, if a university goes under, it's a market, it's, you know, effectively hard cheese, you know, a university goes under and somebody might pick up the pieces, but effectively that's what happens in a market. Now, during the crisis, the government has published what's called a restructuring regime for financially weak institutions. And so we have a much clearer idea of what would happen if a financially weak institution did topple over. And it's not necessarily a pleasant read for those of us who believe in university autonomy, because one of the things that would happen is government would apply lots of strings in return for any extra help. And so I think one thing we might see among financially weaker institutions, now that they have a much clearer idea of what the government would want to do when an institution gets close to the wall financially, we might see institutions thinking more creatively about their legal makeup. And just look actually at what's happened to what we used to call alternative providers in recent times in the UK. You know, the old Charitable College of Law is now a for-profit institution and part of global university systems. The Richmond University, the American University in Richmond now has a strategic partnership with China Education Group Holdings Limited, which is their way of securing the long-term future of their institution. Regent's University, which was previously proudly not-for-profit, has joined Galileo Global Education and taken on a for-profit status as part of a multinational institution. So I think we may see some more lively conversations about the legal status of institutions, whether they federate with other institutions, whether their status changes. Secondly, I think we can be pretty confident that certainly on a per student basis, there will be less funding for teaching and learning. The Auger report, which we're still waiting for the government's response to, recommended a cut in the fee cap in England for full-time students to £7,500 from £9,250. It did recommend that the Treasury should make up the difference, but it also said that there should be a freeze in the total per student resource going to university, amounting to 11% cut between 2018 and 2022, and that assumes that the government made up most of the difference in the fee cap, which I somewhat doubt the Treasury would want to do. And there continue to be live conversations in government about whether the fee cap should be reduced. Whether it is or not, I think we can be pretty certain there'll be less money to educate each student in future, and I think that will make life tough for universities. I think it will make life tough if you're trying to deliver good support services, if you're trying to do good things with your local community, if you're trying to maintain the quality of your estate. I also think, I realise St Mary's staff won't be in the USS, but we'll have different pension arrangements. But I also think it makes it thoroughly implausible that something like the USS pension scheme will continue to be unchanged in the medium term, because it's phenomenally expensive to deliver in a type of pension scheme that barely exists in the private sector anymore. Thirdly, I think the pandemic will leave students wanting more, even though there's less money around to educate them. A lot of students already think they're getting poor value for money and want to get more for their money. Let me just use a very quick anecdote. My sister is a vicar, and during the crisis, she moved all her services online, put them all on YouTube. Her churches are now allowed to be open again, and she can do in-person services. But not surprisingly, her congregation have said, you know, we're really pleased we can come back and do in-person religious worship, but we'd rather like all the online stuff to continue as well. Can we have both in future? And I think there might be an analogy there with our sector. I think students like the convenience and some of the whizzy features of the tech that's been rolled out for our sector, but they also really value the social engagement with lecturers and other students that come from face-to-face teaching. And I suspect they'll demand more of both once the crisis is over, which will be challenging. So fourth on my list of 6, I'm getting It's the end of my time as well, I know. One big difference, which has been a particular challenge in the sector between our higher education system and higher education systems in other countries, is the proportion of our students who opt to live away from home, topic that we have written a lot about at HEPI, as you can see on the slide. Many people think this is too expensive, outdated, and that the pandemic proves those things to be true. But people have always said that. I was reading a report the other day, a white paper the other day that said the government shares the frequently expressed view that it is unrealistic and unnecessary students to study at a distance if equally acceptable courses are available to them within daily travelling distance of their homes. Well, that was the white paper from 1972 that Margaret Thatcher produced when she was the Secretary of State for Education. It didn't happen. I also remember when I worked for David Willits and we were tripling tuition fees, about the insurance company that put out a press release saying universities would become ghost towns from 2012 as everybody would choose to study at home and not go away. But I think the way our system is set up with hierarchical institutions, diverse provision, relatively generous maintenance packages, established student accommodation providers, and so on and so forth, I think our residential model has more legs maybe than people sometimes give it credit for. So my last 2 points, lots of talk about research spending. The government committed in its manifesto to move towards 2.4% of GDP on research and development spending, much of which is spent inside universities. But a lot of people, and of course, just before the crisis, Rishi Sunak promised £22 billion a year public spending on R&D by 2020, well, by the end of this parliament, within a few years' time. A lot of people have banked that money. It was by 2024. 425. Lots of people have banked that money, but just remember 2.4% of GDP will be a smaller cash sum if there's a big recession on the back of this crisis, and also it's not guaranteed to be there given the long list of government priorities. So I think there's some really important issues around R&D spending that we probably haven't got time to go into in detail, but which I'm just laying on the table. My final one of my 6 points is I think we will see a big growth in demand for postgraduate education. We saw it at the last recession. Final year students have the same incentives to stay in education as 18-year-old school leavers do in a recession. And unlike the last recession, there's now much more student finance available for them. So I think one thing we'll see certainly in the short term as a result of this crisis is more people staying on for postgraduate studies. So I'll end there, except to say just 2 quick things. One, I always like to try and end on a positive, and despite I think the fact that COVID will change our sector, just maybe not as much as all those people at the start suggested, we mustn't forget the underlying strengths of our sector. There's huge demand for higher education. There's a growing number of 18-year-olds for the next 10 years. People want to learn in English. We're very strong in research across lots of different disciplines, which is very rare for a country the size of ours. And I think my very final point, what's sometimes called the third mission of universities, all the stuff they do that's not straightforward teaching and learning, working with a local community, working with employers, boosting the economy, being a local employer, all those features of being a university, I think are going to be even more important given the widest changes to society that COVID is wreaking currently. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Before I call Ron to speak, a couple of things. Please, if you have any questions, don't feel that you have to wait until the end of Ron's presentation. Please submit them in the Q&A function now. If there are any relevant links that you want to share, I might ask you, Nick, to share the link to the blog that you mentioned in the chat function. I will share a publication that I know one of my colleagues at the IA wrote on the future of higher education. Please do that in the chat function. Other participants, please feel free to share those links in the chat function. I'll give the floor over to Ron now, and then I will move to Q&A. Ron, thank you very much.
Well, thanks again, and thanks to St Mary's for inviting me to be one of the speakers alongside Nick. I fear that my talk is going to be a few footnotes to what Nick has said, but anyway, let's see how we get on, and I'm going to try and press on fairly swiftly. And you'll see my title, Will the Future Ever Come? And of course, that does fit in very much with the tenor of Nick's opening remarks, which I take to be saying the future has never come. You remember Nick was pointing out people have been promising extraordinary things for higher education, which have seldom come about. But let's press on and see how we do. So I'm going to whiz through a number of general reflections on the character of higher education in this crazy world we're in. And I'm going to offer a kind of argument which takes the form of a couple of questions. As I say, will the future ever come? And if it comes, will it be a worse future or a better future? So what are our bearings? What are mine anyway for this talk, these reflections? I take it we're here to think beyond St Mary's, perhaps even beyond the UK, even beyond Europe, and think about the whole world of higher education. What's our time frame to be in a conversation of this kind? Is it immediate? How long will the pandemic last for? And to what extent can we look beyond the pandemic? And I'll come back to that in a moment. So, getting our bearings, there's the old canard, the is-ought issue. Are we talking about what is likely to be the case, or are we talking about what ought to be the case? And then, as Nick warned us, we're liable, if we're not careful, to become unrealistic in what we think might be the case. Well, I'm going to try and square the circle and think about what we might hope for realistically in the best of all possible worlds, what we might call a feasible utopia. So what is new? Is anything new? And again, Nick was pressing us with this question in a way. And indeed, I want to agree that the pandemic is reminding us of things that we should have already learned. It's reminding us about the climate change, environmental degradation, the impact on the natural world, the impact of humanity on the natural world. Why? Because the virus is reminding us about the interconnectivity of the world. If we think about how the virus has got going and how it's spread across the world and how we're dealing with it, we've got not only, as it were, the natural world and humanity interacting, we've got knowledge, human knowledge, reacting in response to all of that. So the world is in motion. And we have to think about how we're going to, as it were, position higher education against this extraordinary background. And of course, that's problematic because quite rightly in higher education, our understandings of the world vary. Even the scientists don't agree. And that's a very intriguing feature of the current situation. And behind all of that, behind our accounts of the world, stands quite rightly political and human interests. So it's a pretty complex world that we're faced with. What's the time frame? Well, the title of the webinar today, as Nick's reminding us, is Higher Education Post-COVID. Well, how post is post supposed to be? Assume we're going to have some kind of order in 2 years' time. We've now got two situations, what we might call DC and AC, during COVID and after COVID. But what's going to happen after COVID? Are we going to go back to normal? I quite like this quotation that I've just come across. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. But then where should we go? Where might we go from here? We live in a fragile world where our institutions are fragile and higher education is fragile with it. It's fragile in all sorts of ways. The systems of higher education are fragile. Students themselves, goodness knows what it's like to be a student in the current age. The anxiety levels have been with us amongst students for decades, but they must be going up quite considerably, one might assume, at the moment. Fragility amongst staff. What's it like to be a member of staff, having to work online as well as work face-to-face, learn new systems, learn new skills, and our systems of institutions themselves. As Nick said, there's fragility in our financing systems. And then we've got the fragility of what we might call humanity. How are we all facing in this extraordinary world? So the world is in motion, and the university is part of this. The university is itself in motion. And then we try to reflect on it, trying to understand the world. And we know what the world, well, we have a sense of the environment in which we're now placed, an age of authoritarianism and populism. And in this age, the university is becoming and being seen more and more by some states, at least, as a threat. So what is the world that we're in, what higher education is in? I think we're seeing a greater wariness towards the West. And this is going to have an impact on international movement of students. Within the West, we're seeing a skepticism towards higher education. Not only the wider society in the way it looks at higher education, but students themselves perhaps are becoming more skeptical as to what higher education can offer them. And at both levels, we're seeing, I think, an even greater celebration of STEM disciplines. And then there's an issue as to what we're going to do, what's going to happen to the non-STEM areas. Within the national frame, within the UK, I think we're seeing a rebalancing of the education system, more interest, more concern and resource perhaps, relatively flowing towards further education, adult education, and the training sectors. As Nick says, we're going to see greater efficiencies, I think, in the higher education sector, slimmer institutions, slimmer systems, and perhaps a selling off of the estate, or perhaps at least a sharing of the facilities of universities with their local communities. But I think there is going to be a greater call on universities to demonstrate their public goods that they're offering to the wider society. We have to, I think, address, or at least try and be understanding of the impact and the possibilities the internet's offering to the whole world of higher education. And this, despite the many books that have been written on it, I think is not yet fully understood. It seems to me it has both positive and negative possibilities. It's offering extraordinary opportunities, as Nick was implying, for not only for teaching, but also for research. We can now, as this webinar indicates, we can now talk to each other, speak to each other right across the world in ways which weren't possible only very recently. But this environment brings with it, and we're seeing this, I think, in some parts of the world, possibilities of more surveillance of individuals within universities, both in teaching and research. And with it too, as Nick also was implying, perhaps a loss of what we might call conviviality. The university, I think, in this environment, this extraordinary environment, is going to have to understand itself as a moral agent. And what does that mean? Are its values simply going to be its values, or are they universal values that universities worldwide can speak to? Are we going to have a greater sense of compassion for the world, concern for the world, the total world? Problems are going to be heaped upon the university thick and fast in a post-COVID era. And I think this calls for what we might call an ethical imagination on the part of universities. The university as an institution, We need to distinguish, I think, between the university being a global institution from it being international. International students may dwindle to some degree, we don't know. But despite that, universities can be even more global now, particularly with the internet. They can reach out to new communities in quite extraordinary ways. There are all sorts of opportunities for networking, but that also brings the hazard of cyber threats. And so cyber security is going to be a real issue, I think, for universities right across the world. As I said earlier, I think there's going to be a responsibility coming the university's way to identify their public goods, the public goods that they're putting into the world. And each university will have its own profile of public goods. And that's a challenge, I think, coming to each university. What is its profile of its public goods that it's putting into the wider world? For decades, there have been calls for interdisciplinarity, and we've now got to start addressing that. In a complex, mixed up world, the university's disciplines are no longer adequate to dealing with the challenges of a complex, interconnected world. This is something we've ducked for decades. We have to start addressing it seriously. How are we going to affect interdisciplinarity in our institutions? We need to go far beyond the entrepreneurial university and think about new ideas, new models of the university. One idea that's recently come around is that of the commune university, a university that really plugs into its community. What would that mean? Think too about the way in which we can use the internet profitably and positively. Every event now, perhaps, in a university should be in a way a public event. I've been in my writings recently urging the need for the idea of what I'm calling the ecological university. A university has a sense of its interconnections with the total world in all of its manifestations. Whatever the value in that, we need to put our thinking caps on and think about totally new ideas for the university in an extraordinary internet-connected world. Some principles for higher education as an educational process. We need to get students facing up to the difficult issues of the day in which there are no absolute answers, so that they can come into a position of what I call authoritative commitment. This is an extraordinary challenge we heap upon ourselves as human beings in this changing world. Being able to be authoritative in a complex world in which there are no right answers. Seeing the world whole and understanding and what we might think of as critical thinking in a totally new way. The curriculum, we need to have a totally new way of approaching the curriculum. It needs to be pared down, parsimonious, so that students get to grips with basics and then have freedom and space to think themselves into the big pictures of the day, thinking cross-disciplinary and connecting what they're studying with our lives, what's called life-wide learning as well as lifelong learning. Pedagogy, we need to give it a real value as such, not just the curriculum. How are we to engage students with their work, with each other, with ourselves? All sorts of issues there. I'm very taken with Michael Sandel, who can be seen on the BBC as the public philosopher, in which he engages with students all around the world. A bank of 50 video screens in front of him, and you get students facing up to each other, engaging with each other, cross-national, cross-cultural, engaging with big issues of the day, helping students to become global citizens. And so conclusions, there can't be serious, as Nick was saying, there can't be absolute conclusions at a time like this. The university is on a cusp. It has malign possibilities in front of it, in which it can lurch into simple and narrow talk of skills. It can be a subject of surveillance. It can narrow its remit and its academic freedoms can be diminished, or it can open itself up to wholeness, to its engagement with the whole world, and help the world become a more rational, world, a more rational society, the likelihood is surely that these tensions are going to grow into what we might call the post-COVID culture wars of the university. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, both Nick and Ron. You've given us plenty of food for thought. What we're going to do now is move to questions and answers. But the first thing I'll do is just point out in the chat function, Nick has very kindly shared a link to the blog that he discussed in response to the IFS study on universities. I'm going to post a link by one of my colleagues at the EIA, Steve Davies, Dr. Steve Davies, who wrote about the future of higher education. I'm sure there are lots of other publications out there. Please can I encourage my colleagues and others who are joining us to please submit questions. But let me start off with a question to both of you. I'll start with you, Nick, then Ron, and then we'll reverse it for the future questions. One of the things that's been said about the pandemic, one of the authors that I read recently said, pandemics have a tendency to exacerbate pre-existing trends. So, for example, the technology already existed for things like Zoom and Teams meetings, whatever. But it was this pandemic and the lockdown that encouraged us to use them and prove it worked. Now, one of the questions that was being asked before the pandemic was about the universities. We saw a political consensus between Labour and the Tories in terms of getting as many people to university as possible. 50% targets, a dash for quantity rather than quality necessarily. And then people are saying that there needed to be a shake-up anyway before, a shake-up in the university sector anyway before this pandemic. What's your view on that? And if the pandemic hadn't occurred, where were you seeing the university sector going? Were you seeing, say, a speciality in research, liberal arts colleges in the UK, for example? What were you seeing even before the pandemic? Over to you, Nick.
Well, thanks, Ida. There's a huge amount in your question. No, it's fascinating. It's got me thinking. I think I take the basic point that many of the changes being wreaked by the crisis are things that it's acting like a catalyst in a scientific sense. It's speeding up changes, some of which may have happened anyway. And I think your ed tech example is a good one. It may even do that to such a degree that it's making things happen that might not otherwise have happened. I don't know if this will happen or not, but for example, there are parts of the world where distance, remote, online learning was just regarded as hugely inferior. And that was why, for example, Chinese people are much keener to cross boundaries to come and get their higher education. It may be that it becomes more acceptable in countries, particularly in Asia, where that form of learning has been rather looked down upon in the past. And that may, whether that would have happened at all without, I don't know, but it's certainly sped it up a lot, and that could have consequences for actually the whole operating model of British universities. You mentioned the 50% target in quality and quantity, and we could spend a whole webinar talking about that. I would just say one thing. I'd say the government appeared to enter this crisis thinking far too many people go to higher education. Gavin Williamson was making speeches saying he rejected Tony Blair's 50% target. Slightly odd thing to say, given that we've already surpassed the 50% target, and that it was a target for 2010, which is a decade ago, but nonetheless. And at the time, he was imposing, of course, new student number controls on universities, which they then got rid of again. They then did a U-turn on after the A-level results came out and we saw big grade inflation. And if there's one thing I think that row over the summer might have done, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but one thing it might have done is it might have just reminded some politicians that standing in the way of letting people meet their own aspirations is quite an uncomfortable place to be. And Peter Mandler's new book makes that very clear. But that's not the same thing. I want to be clear though, I'm not saying every single course at every single university is brilliant and should never be evaluated for its quality. It absolutely should be. I think we still have very simplistic ways of measuring the quality of courses. I'm struck, I'm currently reading the David Goodhart book, which is actually very down on higher education. But I'm struck by how his attack on higher education is vague and general. He never actually says, look at this specific course here where the curriculum is really thin. and students, not much is expected of students, and it's always a sort of generality. I think we are going to have a really serious debate about the quality and value of individual courses. I hope it's much more detailed level than it has been to date. I'll pause there, even though there's plenty more to say. I know Anthony McLaren, who is of course QAA, have very strong.
Okay, Nick, I think we're getting a bit of echo in your quality, so a bit of buzz. So I wonder if you can address that. Ron, what's your view on why? I know, sorry, it's a very wide question, and we could be here all day. But I want to get the conversation going in terms of exacerbating pre-existing trends that were happening anyway. What was happening? Over to you, Ron.
Well, I think if I say so, the question's spot on, and let me pick out just a couple of things, and to emphasise what I was saying in my talk. I think the crisis is causing us to think about pedagogy and curriculum, and to understand that they are quite different. They're both important, but they're different. So we're thinking now about the pedagogical relationship. How is it that we help and inspire and encourage students to learn and to get engaged with their studies and with each other? How do we actually bring that about? So I think that is going to become an even, we were moving that direction. All the talk about student satisfaction and so forth, we're moving in that direction. I think we're going to be doing even more of that. How do we use the space of higher education to get students inspired, energized towards their courses? And of course, there's a real problem here, elephant in the room and all that, of non-completion. The evidence across the world is that the more online work you have, the higher the attrition rates or the non-completion rates. So we've got to start thinking about how we really keep students with us, encourage them, enthuse them, and inspire them and keep them on side. And we've got to give thought to that. And I think the crisis that we're in at the moment is going to prompt us to give even more thought in that direction. So far as curriculum is concerned, we were already moving in using the internet to help students link up not only with each other, but with other classrooms in other parts of the world. So you could, in some parts of Europe, you can do degree courses across universities. And I think we're going to see more of that. I hope we're going to see more of that, using the internet to connect students up with other networks, other centres around the world. Imagine the excitement there could be if you put a civil engineering course in the West in contact with one in a developing country, and all the national, cross-cultural exchanges there could be. So I think both pedagogy and curriculum are going to be prompted to go even further in the directions they were going. And to pick up that so far as academics are concerned, again, come back to my point about interconnectivity. And for example, this webinar and others like it, I've been struck by the way in which now academic conferences are just being held in a most complex way online. And you wonder whether we're ever going to see again face-to-face conferences, people getting on aircraft. You bump into people in airports that you know, and you know they're going off to another conference. So are we going to see all of that dwindle? Are we going to see new kinds of internet networking, conferencing, new interactivity across continents? Is this going to be a way in which the so-called global north can engage more with the global south? I think there are all sorts of possibilities in front of us.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask my colleagues, please do submit some questions. We've got about 5 minutes left. The reason we are not going right up to the hour is because I know teaching has resumed and people do have to go somewhere on the hour for their teaching, or people have made that point quite clearly. But in the absence of any other questions, let me ask you one, and I'll start with you, Ron, because you and I have had some discussion on this. One of the questions being asked, I know Nick raised it as well in his presentation, was one of the things that we see in this this lockdown and the pandemic was different relations with China. And I say that as someone who teaches on the global governance course and international relations and foreign affairs. And if you look at the relations with China, there were concerns before, economic concerns, technology concerns, intellectual property concerns, some of their military concerns in their neighborhood. And the way that China's responded to COVID, in terms of not sharing the data early on, for example, has increased suspicion of China. And there are people who are asking the questions about the way that the UK universities and US universities have opened up so much to Chinese students. And I know you and I have had some conversations about this, Ron. Where do you see that going, or is that just based on pure prejudice, or is there, are there measures that universities should be taken to make sure we get the balance right?
Well, I think these are extremely complex and sensitive issues, and I'm not sure how far one wants to go in a space and forum like this, to be honest, because some of them are so delicate and difficult. But if we look at the quality newspapers and magazines and see the reports that are coming out about higher education and the Chinese dimension across the world, I did use the term surveillance in my talk, and that is very much the kind of dimension I had in mind. The new technologies give states opportunities to monitor what academics and students are doing all over the world. And there are concerns that we see state surveillance now in Western universities. And there are reports that Oxford University, but others in the States, are now modifying their teaching arrangements, their teaching processes, the pedagogical process, because of concerns of this kind. So that's all going to have to play itself out. But it shows how higher education now has become a matter of global politics. And I think we have to be very careful about how we take all of that forward.
Okay, Nick, let me ask you very briefly, because we've got one more question from one of my colleagues. But Nick, any response to that question about China and Chinese students?
Well, I've just posted in the chat a link to a paper, which was a collection of essays that we published recently on relationships between UK and China, with a particular focus on HE. And I think our overwhelming, the theme that runs through all the chapters is we do have to be very careful, how Ron said, but equally engagement is better than disengagement. So it depends how you engage, but we shouldn't disengage. Thank
you. I've also posted a link to something I co-authored about a classical liberal approach, very much a philosophical one, political philosophy approach to post-pandemic relations with China. I've posted that in the links. Last question from Peter Hill, Dr. Peter Hill at St Mary's, and I'm going to start with you, Nick, and then Ron. Do you think, with increasing funding for further education, FE, and less support for higher education rates, higher participation rates in higher education, do you think this will impact the sector? Nick?
Well, it's a big question, and clearly there'll be some impact on the sector. But I think there is, including in the government's outlook on the world, a simple binary division that just does not exist. It is not the case that if you boost FE, HE must wither. Very often FE, for example, is the pipeline, the supply chain for students into HE, to take just one example. And the Association of Colleges are very clear about that. The Universities UK are very clear about that. And I think it's really important as we enter the end of the transition period, as we try to think about what the economy looks like post-COVID, as we grapple with climate change, as we try to deliver the skills employers need, that we think about FE and HE being part of the same whole, rather than constantly competing against one another. I'd love to say more, but that's probably all we've got.
No, that makes the point really well, the complementarity factor of that, and how it's not one against the other. Ron?
Well, I don't have anything much to add to that. I totally agree with everything Nick has just said on that front. People don't realise that 10 to 15% of people in higher education are actually studying in further education colleges. There have been considerable overlaps, and we're seeing those overlaps develop, and I think we're going to see more and more. There have been attempts to develop comprehensive universities in England, one or two, and they haven't really got very far for different reasons, where you have both higher education and further education systematically in the same institution. They tend to be held rather apart in further education colleges, but it's a real issue, and I think the more we can see the two overlapping, as they have in the States, you can go into a community college and you can take credits into the mainstream higher education system, and I think we're going to hopefully, I mean, we've been talking about it actually for 30 or 40 years in this country, and hopefully we're going to see that divide become much more fluid.
On that, let me ask a quick question with about 1 minute left, which is this: has further education effectively filled the gap left behind when polytechnics became universities? FE are now almost filling that gap left behind, that sort of mixture of technical education, not as and some academic education as well. So not academic, higher education. Sorry, Nick.
To a degree, but not entirely. I mean, for example, a lot of what FE colleges do is dealing with lower level skills, with 16 to 18 or people doing level 3 qualifications, whether they're 16 to 18 or older, and so they're not a straightforward replacement for polytechnics, but clearly neither are they entirely different.
Yeah. Ron, do you want a view on that?
Well, I didn't add that I do hope we're going to see the role and remit of further education colleges better articulated. They become rather a catch-all for all sorts of functions and educational purposes. One of the things has been said, and again many times, actually for 200 years in this country, that we lack a proper technical system. And I hope a technical education system, I hope that we're now building on work that Alison Wolfe and others have done, we're going to start really getting hold of that issue and build up a proper programme of technical qualifications of real worth and quality.
Well, Nick Hillman and Professor Ron Barnett, thank you very much for joining us today. So I think it's been a fascinating both presentations and conversation. Can I also thank people who tuned in today, who logged in via Zoom to join us, and for your questions as well. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you will join us again for our next St Mary's webinar, which will be advertised on our St Mary's website. But in the meantime, please stay safe. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Nick, and thank you for joining us. Have a safe day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.